Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 68. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and I love the NBA playoffs because night after night, something special happens, including last night in Joel Embiid just getting buckets in every which way, including a game winner. I'm going to tell you this. Please let's not pretend as if that makes up for the 4 bounce, because nothing ever will. On a side note, more than that, but the record still stands as the overall NBA bets. We keep rolling along. I know we've slowed down from being on the wave that we were on, but the overall record is still 24-12-1 for NBA bets put out on this podcast. So we got more of that coming up. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports all-new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With so many big sporting events here, it's the best way for you to make some money this postseason and have fun while doing it. DRF Sports Pro, sign up now at drf.com/sports. And as mentioned, coming up, we'll get you caught up with the latest in the NBA playoffs, where the series was, where the series is, and where the series could be going. We hit you with some picks for the upcoming games. And of course, Matt Russell stops by to join us to give us his take as well. And luckily for y'all, that starts right about now. The NBA playoffs are in high gear. And of course, my guy, Mr. Matt Russell, has to stop by to join us as we continue with pretty solid run from the last pod. I'll put it out there. The game 2 picks actually went 4-4. So, I mean, the wave isn't as high as it was before. I'm still sitting here and I'll take a 24-12-1 record. I'll still take that with the NBA bets overall. We're still winning. That's the goal here. To win. Mr. Matt Russell, though, how you doing, my dude?
I'm good, man. And it's funny funny that you mentioned the record. We always like to talk about the record and all of that sort of thing, because people get all obsessed about what's your record. Yeah, you're 24-12, and you go, okay, that's 66%. And if we asked you to go 66% at any point in time in your life, you'd be like, could you lower the bar a little bit, right? Because 66% probably a little bit too high. But you know what? So was 75% the way that you were going there early on. But it's funny because we came on the show on Monday, and I was like, yeah, I basically went 5-5 over the course of this early round. And then I've all of a sudden gotten a little bit hot here, right? Where we'll get into series by series and some of the victories along the way. But there was, and I think we might talk about the Sixers and the Raptors today. But if it wasn't for that colossal collapse, I would have would have swept the board from Tuesday through Wednesday. And so now I'm up 5 over 500. So it's just sort of funny how it works out, right? Like, we could be simpatico on every single game. By nature, we're just not going to be. But if we both end up at the end of this whole thing with a really good record, kind of doesn't really matter how we got there, right? Sometimes you're going to have a good weekend, sometimes I'm going to have a good week, and vice versa. But listen, if the people are out there and they're picking and choosing the stuff that I win on and the stuff that you win on, then they're loving life right now. Hopefully that's the case and it's not the other way around. So all in all, really exciting start to these playoffs. Again, as a relative casual fan of the NBA, these games, first of all, very interesting, and second of all, setting up series that are becoming more and more interesting here with obviously a couple of exceptions here.
Yeah. And I mean, everything so far has been pretty fun during the NBA playoffs. Most of the series, at least there's some storyline or something to follow that's been interesting in each series. And from a betting standpoint, to me, I would assume that most people, if you're actually betting, what you're doing is you're looking for someone to either back up what you already think or give you a good enough reason to counter what you already think, right? It's one side or the other. It's not, I mean, it's nothing crazy. Everyone, it's fun at the same time. And plus, we're out here trying to win. So as mentioned, play-in/playoff record, 14-8 at this point. And I mean, we're just trying to keep that going. Let's start here, though. Keep starting in the Eastern Conference. Last night, there were a bunch of games. You got the Celtics and the Nets. Boston leads that series 2-0. And, you know, if you go back to even when we did the preview with Drew, obviously everyone was on board with the Celtics being able to win this series. So being 2-0 against the spread in this series isn't that much of a surprise if you were paying attention. Celtics win game 2, 114-107. And it's not looking good for the Nets. KD struggled all series, pardon me. And we talked about the defense being the thing that was going to be really difficult. Kevin Durant and Kyrie were going to have to play at a super high level for the Nets to have a chance in the series. Kyrie held up his end of the bargain in game 1. We talked about it in our last pod. Didn't think he'd be able to do that in game 2. And there's the L, right? Like Kevin Durant in that second half, 0 for 10 with 4 turnovers, which is insane to me. I think the stat says, where is it here? I have it. It's the most field goal attempts without a single make in any half of his entire career. That's not an accident, right? It's the Celtics defense. We talked about it from the get-go. This was just a bad matchup for the Nets, and they're heading back home now, down 2-0. Saturday, Nets are favored by 3.5. And I'd really love to think Brooklyn's going to win this game. It's not like they're going back to like some MSG crowd that's going to be this huge, great home crowd advantage. It's going to be okay for them. I'm sure they're going to play well, but I'm going to take Boston in the points. I just think Boston at this point, it's a matchup thing and they got it figured out. Will they end up sweeping them? I mean, you'd assume there has to be I'm the Kevin Durant game. Will that come in game 3? Will that come in game 4? What's Ben Simmons up to? Who the heck knows? But the way that I'm playing this series right now, if you're telling me that you're going to give me 3.5 points with the Celtics, I'm going to take the 3.5 points. That's just where I'm at this point. Where are you right now with this series?
Yeah, so I mean, just quick cleanup. I know that you probably meant 2-0 straight up because obviously 1-1 on the spread there with the Celtics because they, of course, did not cover that first game. So just want to clean that up for everybody who sort of got their ears perked up. Yeah, because to me it doesn't feel like it's like, oh, the Celtics are up 2-0 in the series. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. And I mean, part of that is because I think in terms of against the spread, where I go like, yeah, you have to remind me that the Celtics actually won the game on the court in that first game. But I just look at it like this. Okay, like when you've got the KD stats and all of that makes sense. But like if that's the thing that you're going to be worried about, I'm always going to lean towards, KD is going to be fine in the next game. Like who else can we trust if we can't trust KD? But I think in this frames all of these series that flip from, obviously games 1 and 2 being in one location to 3 and 4 being in another location. And, we'll talk about this series as mentioned before, but the one that hasn't, right, is the Sixers and the Raptors. And what happened in that game from a Raptors standpoint to get them the lead was the supporting cast played really well, right? And when we go from road to home, that's what changes in these series, right? By and large, the stars be the stars, and they're doing what they normally do. It's less about the crowd, though obviously the crowd can factor in, but to me, it's about what the role players are going to be. All of a sudden, you end up getting 20 points from a guy who isn't necessarily the guy who's going to get you 20 points, right? We're going to see like Bruce Brown being a guy who's going to actually have a pretty good game here, right? Like Steph Curry's probably going to be better in this game. Like those types of players are the ones that are going to show up in this next game. So I'm going to be on the Nets minus 3.5 because I don't see them getting swept. And I think there's a lot of different points if you sort of hit pause in the middle of the game in these last 2 games where you're like, wait, the Nets lost both these games, right? Like they have clearly shown that they can certainly can compete. And, I felt like once things got really going uphill there for the Nets in that game yesterday, right, the Celtics crowd absolutely factored in. Right. And so like that's not going to be there. So even if it's a neutral site type of a game with obviously familiar shooting lines and a familiar sort of habitual situation for the Nets and the supporting players, like, again, for as all as like Kyrie played obviously amazing in game one and obviously had some, situations last night. It's like, I think he's going to play really well. I think KD is going to play really well. And I think they're going to get something from somebody else. And when it comes to how close these games have actually been, that I think is enough to turn the tables. And we see again a lot of these games, once they go to game 3, things switch. The fun part about these playoffs and this weekend coming up is look at all the point spreads. It's like pick'em game city here. Yeah. Right? Like this is going to be really, really fun. And like there's pick'em games on series that weren't particularly close in the first 2 games, right? This one was actually close. And yeah, this game isn't a pick'em. This is a -3.5 situation here for the Nets. But like this team's certainly good enough that if, again, there was a point yesterday where it's like they're up 15 points or whatever, and you go, man, they are up 15 here. They very easily could have won game 1. And you just go like, this might be a team that could get to the championship or win a championship. Obviously, we have to see how things shake down. Listen, there's a long way to go. Injuries happen. We've already sort of seen that kind of pile up here. And so it just so happened that the last 5 minutes or the last 5 seconds in game 1 didn't go the Nets' way. But like just getting to that point was really, really impressive for me, for a team that, again, we haven't had that much nice things to say going into this playoffs. So game 3, certainly -3.5. And then probably I'll be on it again in game 4. Again, we'll see what happens, with that game and how that sort of shakes down. Trend wise, you normally see, the Nets in this situation be the -3.5 favorite. And then kind of no matter what happens in game 3, the line actually drops, because if the Nets win, you go, okay, well, if that's the bounce back, the dead cat bounce, if you will, that, okay, they win and cover, but now game 4 is the like make or break game, right? The pivotal game of the series, and the line will get a little bit tighter in that situation. Now, if the Celtics go and they win the game, or even if they cover, the line might come down then as well, right? Because we've obviously shown that maybe 3.5 is too many for the Nets. So in both cases, I'm going to like the Nets in this game. I'm going to like them at a shorter number in game 4, which I expect to see no matter what happens. So I don't think this is the last we've heard of the Nets. Again, the Celtics still very probable to win the series. The odds in the series line reflect that. We're looking at what, plus 350 to plus 375, something along those lines. And listen, if there was ever a situation where there was a 2-game lead where, as they say, series doesn't start until a team loses at home, if there was ever a situation where there was a 2-game lead where we might look up and this series could be 2-2. And if you're sitting on you finally weigh in on the series and it's maybe grabbing a plus 375, something along those lines with the Nets, I got to say, out of all of them that are 2-0 right now, this would be the one that would make the most sense logically to be 2-2 after we get through the whole the Brooklyn saga, so to speak, this weekend.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. For me, I'm just where I'm at with the Nets. It's like their only chance is if Ben Simmons comes back and gives them something. And I don't really see that being a thing. I just think there's too much on the shoulders of Kevin Durant, like having to play all second half, and the parallels between, and the names are not the same, but the feat is the same, if that makes sense. Like the feat that they will have to accomplish in terms of Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and then Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet. You have to carry way too much of the load and responsibility for your team. So you're able to do it for the majority of the game. But then once it comes down to winning time, you're just out of gas. You don't have enough in the tank, and you're going against too good of a team. And for the Boston Celtics, KD might get his 30, but he's going to have to work for that 30. And he hasn't been able to work and get that big boy game yet. And obviously he's Kevin Durant. I would just hope that they had more than Steve Nash to try to figure it out, other than rolling the ball out and being like, all right, KD, your turn to go one-on-one. All right, Kyrie, your turn to go one-on-one. Can somebody get an easy basket here, Steve? Let's draw something up, my dude. I love Steve Nash, by the way, obviously Canadian legend. Of course. Like, just a tough spot for the Nets right now. And I think at this spot where they're at, Kevin Durant getting swept out of the first round of the playoffs is a very unlikely scenario, right? Ain't nobody lining up to like sit here and bet on that. So,
and that's it. Like they haven't had the Kevin Durant game. And like, again, like, do you think Grant Williams is going to play the same way, on the road than he is at home, right? Even an Al Horford at this point, is he going to play the same way on the road as he did at home? So it's not just that the Nets are going to get more from the non-Kyrie KD group. It's also that the Celtics, if you're going to expect Peyton Pritchard, right, to play that well on the road in the playoffs, like history is littered. Like we're talking like almost 100% of the time that stuff dips, right? And there's also just the natural, like, hey, we're up 2-0, like we're feeling pretty good about ourselves, even though, again, at any point during these games or various points during these games, it looks like the Nets are going to win comfortably. So, again, I just think this is one where the Celtics, we signed up after game 1 for 7 games of this, right? I still think we get 7 games of this. This might be the series where just the home team wins every single time. And honestly, at 3.5, like the Nets could very well win by 2 or 3 points, right? This could be the KD wins it at the buzzer type of a game. And so like, I get why you'd want to take the Celtics plus the 3.5 here. But to me, this is still just like, okay, both teams are going to be favored by 3.5 points, right? No, depending on who's home. And like, it could be a close game like it was last night, and the Celtics end up covering in the end, right? Yeah. Relatively comfortably, certainly in the last couple of minutes. And so again, like those points, like, okay, that obviously guards against the last second type shot, but it certainly doesn't guard against it being a close game and things getting stretched out towards the end, because again, it's not going to be an electric atmosphere in the first 3 quarters, but Brooklyn in the fourth quarter, if that game ends up being close, might be, right? And that might be the difference between getting the key play from the Celtics, other guys. And one last thing before we move on, when Ben Simmons comes back, like, and maybe that's in game 4, and it obviously brings a decision for me in game 4, but I'm absolutely fading the Nets, because if there's any adjustment to the line when Ben Simmons comes back, a guy who hasn't played in over a year, if the expectation is that he's going to save the day and that's going to actually change anything from a point spread standpoint, no, hard pass on that. Like that's at the very least I'll walk away from, if not a complete fade the Nets situation there. But it doesn't look like he's coming back. Certainly in game 3, 4 seems like an aggressive thing. And as far as we know, right, it might not be at all, because let's be honest, right, this is Ben Simmons, and I don't think he has any interest in actually playing basketball. And frankly, I never really have.
Yeah, it's a super, super strange series. And it's going to just get even weirder, just because, the Nets can't get stops, and that's why they keep blowing the game late in all of these games. If you can't get stops, you're going to lose in the NBA playoffs, much like the Toronto Raptors against the Philadelphia 76ers. Sixers lead 3-0 in this series after an epic performance by Joel Embiid. Give the man 33 points, 13 rebounds in a 104-101 overtime victory, a game winner, and a massive dunk on Pascal Siakam that apparently stole his soul. On the pod, I've been wrong on this series in games 1 and 2, way off, in fact. And for me, I guess looking at it, the Raptors without Barnes have just been too difficult to predict. Trent Jr. was dealing with some sickness that games 1 and 2, he was completely ineffective. Nick Nurse talking about how he probably shouldn't have even played in game 2. Game 3, Gary Trent Jr. seemed to be back, and he seemed to be doing pretty well for the Toronto Raptors. The problem being their top 2 guys, Siakam and Van Fleet, just struggled, and Raps are cooked. Sixers are favored by 3 on Saturday. I'm going to be on the Sixers, and the reason being because if you're the Toronto Raptors, I mean, again, I don't know if Scotty Barnes is going to come back and play, but he was out of the walking boot. I don't know what that means, right? But he could play in game 3, and obviously that will change something, whether it's the line or like which side of this game or this game that I'm on, if we're going into game 3 on Saturday. But I'm more interested just to see, game 4, pardon me. I'm just more interested to see how serious the Sixers are about life. Because if you are serious about life and you're the Sixers, cool. You went out in Toronto. It's Toronto. I understand. You got to have some fun. You went out on Wednesday night, Thursday, you kind of chill. Saturday, you get back to business, and that game is Saturday afternoon. So I want to see what the Sixers really do and how they come out, because the Raptors, I think you're down 3-0. The chances of you coming back and winning this series are very slim in their minds. So they might be in 1-2-3 Cancun mode as as soon as that, picks up, do you really want to go to Philly for game 5? Like really? So that's what I'm more interested in. And I'm going to bet on the Sixers. Not going to really like it, but that's where I'm at in this series.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, obviously looking back last night, right? Like that was brutal. That was honestly there's been a lot of, there have been a lot of head scratching performances in like the history of the Toronto Raptors in the playoffs, right? Like the non-Kawhi years. And like that one last night, I think was like right up there because you had, again, we talk about the shift, right? From road to home and the supporting characters, and like Gary Trent Jr. plays this great game. And like, speaking of like dumb bets, speaking of dumb bets, but like in the category of dumb bets, I say to my fiance last night, I'm like, she's like, what do you think's happened in the game tonight? I was like, I think the Raptors win. And then I'm like, she's like, you bet on this? I was like, yes, of course. Yeah, I have made a modest bet on this. And then I say to her, the key here is going to be Gary Trent Jr., right? He's going to have to make some shots here. He's going to have to be healthy, blah, blah, blah. Do I bet the over on any Gary Trent Jr. props? No, of course I don't. I just bet the Raptors money line, right? And so if I had bet the Gary Trent Jr. props, the guy who I thought was going to be the key to victory, right, I just been sitting pretty and I wouldn't have had to take the daggers that were the end of that game, right? And so you go, man, you really should if you're going to sort of lock something into that point. But you know what? I'm not going to beat myself too much here because I kind of thought you'd get something out of Pascal Siakam. I kind of thought you'd get something out of Fred VanVleet. Now, obviously, they did something, but clearly not enough with like what a collective, 10 for 30 something shooting or whatever it was. So, I go, okay, like imagine getting the performance that you got out of Gary Trent Jr. and OG Anunoby, again, another sort of supporting character, in theory, and not winning that game, right? And again, you can come down to the free throws and you can blame Precious Achiuwa for that, but like I'm not going to do that. I thought he was really good outside of that game, right? So I think he was a net positive. It just so happens that he gets the stage late in that game. And by the way, if he makes those shots, maybe things get a little bit different on the offensive end, right? It doesn't mean that the Sixers are definitely going to get that horrendous shot at the end of regulation and, basically just take overtime, right? If you're a little bit more desperate, who knows, right? Obviously, the Embiid shot at the end, the thing that kills me about the Embiid shot is he makes the shot and he wasn't really required to make the shot. Like this wasn't a tie game. They weren't down. He actually only needed to hit the rim, right? Like there's 2 seconds between the shot clock and the game clock. Like if the man hits the rim and the ball goes up into the air, or maybe it does a 4 bounce and out, in a sort of poetic thing, nod to Kyrie from a few years ago. Like Kawhi. All the guy needs to do, Kawhi, is that all he needs to do is just hit the rim. Like hit the rim, ball goes up in the air, and time basically is going to run out virtually, right? You're not gonna be able to get the rebound. I don't even think the Raptors had a timeout at that point. Maybe they did, but they certainly didn't after he made the shot. And so you just go, okay, like of course he makes it because now he gets to strut around, and it's an extra like salt in the wound where like if he had missed the shot, like he still wouldn't have gotten that like level of excitement and sort of credit or whatever you sort of want to call that. So anyway, that's really frustrating from that performance, right? And obviously you go into the shot quality, I like to look at the shot quality, and yeah, the Raptors should have edged the Sixers in, due to shot quality, right? It was something like a 55-45. But, the first half of that game, they get out to that 15-point lead. And speaking of kicking myself from a betting standpoint, right, there's a sort of tried and true, and I don't know, maybe if it's true, but it's certainly tried, that in these game threes, right, in these pick'em type games, and again, we have a laundry list of these pick'em type games for game 3. You want to grab the home team in the first half, right? Because you're going to get the best effort. You're going to get them the sort of jump on them effect in the first half. And then unfortunately there's 48 minutes. So as a game progresses, right, the better team, the cream is going to rise to the top. So Raptors had 10-point lead, right? It was -1. It's funny because the Raptors are -1 in the first half, but +2 in the game. So the odds makers adjust for that, right? But in the case of a pick'em game where you have a +2 and a -1, like both of those are basically just requiring the team to win that segment, right? So the Raptors just needed to win that first half, even if they had made it +1 or -1. Doesn't, shouldn't say it doesn't matter because occasionally it will matter, but it's not really going to matter the vast majority of the time in that situation, right? So again, I don't make that bet. I go full bore thinking that the Raptors organizationally, culturally, however you want to sort of frame that, they're going to step up. And so now I'm looking at this game in game 4, and it's interesting that you're going to be on the Sixers, because my initial instinct is like, yes, 1, 2, 3 Cancun, but I sort of pose to you, like, a lot of what the Raptors do is sort of an organizational thing, right? Like everybody talks about heat culture, but like that's what the Raptors are trying to do, right? They're trying to get people locked in on a Raptors culture. Now, the problem is every time they have an opportunity to show quote unquote Raptors culture, they play a game or a second half like they did yesterday. And so they don't get any credit for it, right? So it's right now only a regular season, quote unquote, Raps culture type thing, where if a guy goes out, they're able to step up and all of that sort of stuff, right? And so I look at this and I go, man, like you obviously the line move from 2 up to 3. That's obviously the sort of 1, 2, 3 Cancunification of the, of the market here. But I just go, if the Raptors, and then whether they get Scotty Barnes back or not, because listen, if Scotty Barnes plays in that game, right, it's probably worth a bucket at some point, and they probably win that game in regulation. I mean, I realize that's an abstract concept, but again, that's a guy who can fill a role where you had some guys who maybe didn't necessarily need the spotlight yesterday, right? And so getting minutes. So I'm leaning to the Raptors +3 because like I think there is some pride in the organization. And if you are going to give me an extra point in a game that they should have won, right? This wasn't just like, oh man, the Sixers are just better than us in that game last night, because that wasn't the case, right? That certainly was the case in the first 2 games. But listen, they just weren't able to make up for the fact that Barnes was injured and Gary Trent Jr. was sick and et cetera, right? Like, okay, I think we got a full strength Gary Trent Jr. I think and it's weird to say like that's like this really important thing. But when we're talking about outside shooting in the NBA these days, like, yeah, that's a really important thing. And if Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam are anything close to a 1, 2, 3, like something along those lines on your team, and I think that's the, obviously the main issue with the Raptors from a sort of ceiling standpoint is they don't have a number 1, right? They just have a couple of 2s and 3s here, but that's why they're a 5 seed that might, 2 weeks ago was an 8 seed or a 7 seed. Like, this isn't a championship team, but is this a team that at home against the 76ers team, you make another great point, right? How locked in are the Sixers going to be in this game, right? Like they're, you tweeted yesterday that Embiid missed an opportunity to hit him with the airplane celly, right? At the old, formerly known as the ACC Air Canada Center. Like, I'm just not positive that the Sixers, they have to play a part in this too, because I think there's pride enough for the Raptors to not 1, 2, 3 Cancun it. But I also think the Sixers are very capable of going, we're headed back to Philly anyway, right? Like, we have this 3-0, no team, it's obviously we're obligated to mention that no team's ever come back from down 3-0 in the NBA. Like, I think that there's a very real chance they don't just party at Wednesday. I'm absolutely positive they partied on Wednesday night. I think they maybe roll that into Thursday. And honestly, in the case of, James Harden, maybe even a Friday. It just kind of sucks for the Raptors, right? Because this is a situation where you would have really liked to sort of roll the dice and have it come up with the schedule of like the Nets and Celtics, for example, right? Like, how great would it be if the Raptors were playing game 2 last night, whether it's the health of Gary Trent Jr. being that healthy in game 2 in Philadelphia, or extending the Scotty Barnes, situation where he's not in a boot in game 2. And now all of a sudden in game 3 on Saturday, in the same schedule that the Nets and the Celtics have, like, they just kind of got screwed over a little bit, not intentionally by any means, nothing like that, but just like the roll of the dice, these sort of ping pong balls, if you will, of scheduling. Because even this next game, again, Saturday afternoon versus Friday night, like, how much difference is that going to be? Like, the fact that there's 2 games off so that the Sixers can go out and party and celebrate that win, and they still get sort of 2 days to recuperate if they show that discipline. Like, that's also kind of a bummer in this situation, right? So like, there's just, everything was kind of, up against it for the Raptors here. And so that's kind of a drag, but, it's not going to be a massive bet, and I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet. And we'll see where the market goes as far as, maybe steaming this upwards. And again, obviously the Scotty Barnes, is he not going to play situation? It's going to be an element to this. But again, maybe I'm just running my head into a wall here, but I actually think the Raptors do win game 4 on a pride, organizational, cultural type thing here. And then it's probably curtains in game 5 back in Philadelphia.
Yeah, no, totally a scenario that I could see happening for sure there with the Toronto Raptors. Bulls and Bucks series tied at 1. Bulls win game 2, 114 to 110. DeMar DeRozan drops 41. Pardon me. Salute to him for that after he struggled mightily in game 1. And I mean, credit to him because he said in the post game, I won't do that again. And, big boy game for DeMar. But the big story might be the fact that Chris Middleton goes down with the sprained MCL, which is obviously horrible news for the Bucks. But this is a series now, right? Game 3 is Friday night. Bucks favored by 1.5 in Chicago. I'm going to be on the Bulls, though, and I think this is a tough game, but I think it's one of those, we're going back home to Chicago. That crowd is going to be just on fire, and I really think that the Bucks are going to need at least one game to figure out kind of the pecking order now or what the roles are without Middleton. He's a huge part of their team. He's their number 2 guy, obviously, but also he's a guy who, with so much focus on Giannis sometimes down the stretch and crunch time, he can get a bucket. And so you remove that from your team. It might take a game to figure out, hey, Drew Holiday, we need you to go here. Hey, Giannis, just put your head down and go to the basket every other time again. But either way, tough break for the Bucks here, but give me Chicago and basically a pick'em game here at home.
So can I interest you in, again, this is sort of a matter of like public service announcement, right? Like I just mentioned with the Raptors and the Sixers. Can I interest you in Bulls first half instead? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that's the one where like, yes, we immediately, because that's the first page, so to speak, on the odds board is like, side and total for the game. And again, hindsight being 2020, I really wish I just bet Raptors first half. Also wish I bet Gary Trent Jr. overs, right? In this case for the Bulls, like maybe that adjustment, listen, you and I don't have a ton of faith in Coach Bud. We have talked about this on many a podcast and many iterations of it. Maybe they get that figured out in the first half. Maybe they get that figured out in the third quarter, something along those lines, right? Like I want the least amount of time for the Bucks to get anything sort of figured out. And on the case of Chris Middleton, again, as a so much casual observer of the Bucks, right? Like Chris Middleton can also shoot you out of games, right? Again, history is littered with a bunch of like, man, Chris Middleton was brutal last night and da. And they need Chris Middleton to be good to beat really good teams, right? They needed him to be good to win a title last year, but they don't really need him to win a game against the Bulls. Now the Bulls need 41 from DeRozan, right? And obviously a lot of that in the mid-range game. But if you go into what's my favorite, right? Shot quality. If you go into shot quality, right? The Bucks should have won that game the majority of the time. I think it ended up being something along the lines of around 2/3 of the time. So, when was the last time that we saw some, like a shot quality stat like this, right? Like Grizzlies, Timberwolves, for example, right? Like these are the indicators of what should be sort of happening going forward. So I think the Bulls have that first half push. It's obviously a little bit different when you're not down 0-2 as far as like both teams sort of like, okay, now we're locked in here on this 1-1 series, which sucks because our series bet is, we were running, everybody, the world was running to hop on the Bucks, getting, it was like -1, I think it was early on, it was like -110, but it ended up closing like -190 for the Bucks on the series price, the series handicap price. We're all running for that. And then all it takes, we talked about in the first game, right? Taking the Bulls +10 and threading the needle. Last night, we couldn't thread the needle, right? I would have loved a Bucks win by less than 10. Didn't happen. We end up cashing Bulls +10. So now we're up 2 units on the series. And now we go, okay, I'm just going to sit back and hope the Bucks can somehow pull off the next 3 games, which obviously 2 of those games being against, or being in Chicago, are, certainly now don't feel that likely that they're going to get both of those games. But before the series started, like, yeah, we thought the Bulls, they could win in Chicago. And so like, I'm certainly not going to lay the -1.5 with the Bucks here. I'm just going to now cheer for that series bet. I'm going to keep, I'm going to have those 2 units in the back pocket, right? And I'm just going to go, okay, let's try to pull one off here when it comes to the Bucks. But I think when it comes to single game, individual game betting here in this one, I think this is, the standard Bulls. They're, again, they're -1.5. The Bucks are, I should say. which means, right, like you would think that the Bucks would be favored for the first half. They are not going to be. You're going to see the same situation where, in this case, the Bulls are going to be -1. But as we just talked about, right, I rather just take the first half here. -1 isn't going to be that much of a difference versus pick 'em or even +1. I'm grabbing the Bulls here a little bit in the first half, and then I'm going to hope they win by like 2 points in the first half, and then the Bucks come back in the second half and end up winning. But that all that stuff is knock on wood. But the point is, like, you don't need to make this more difficult. And well, there's going to be other examples of this. You don't need to make betting more difficult than it already is, right? You're already going to have interest in the Bucks winning this game and the next game if they're able to win this game, which again, small favorite. 2% chance that they win this game. That's where I am with this series as far as betting it. I'm probably done betting it when it comes to a full game. We'll see, obviously, if this goes 5 or 6, and I no longer have that stake in that series price, right, or in that series handicap. So yeah, this is sort of just a walk away and just kind of go, okay, we've done what we've needed to do, getting the value. And you and I pointed it out before game 1, right? +10 was too many for this Bulls team that can compete. I'm just going to walk away from it at this point, take my couple of units here, and hope the series handicap price does a little bit better for us here down the once it went down the road in Chicago, so to speak.
I got you. Heat Hawks. Heat are up 2-0 in this series. Game 3 will be Friday night. Heat are favored 1.5 points in Atlanta. You think the Hawks win a game at home? That would be, that would make sense. You would think Trae Young getting to woof it up once or twice in front of the hometown crowd. But I just, basketball wise, this is kind of like a Celtics Nets thing for me, where there's just certain series where it's like, this is a bad matchup, and especially a shorthanded Hawks team. I don't know. Miami's just kind of shown that this isn't going to go well for the Hawks. Do they get one of these games? Sure, maybe. I'm just not going to bet on which one it's going to be. So I'm just going to ride the Heat here and take them -1.5. Just where I'm at in this series. Where are you?
Yeah. I mean, again, at this point, right, like there's not that much there. And again, listen, we can do the sort of broken record thing here, but like, yeah, this is the situation where you bet the Hawks, right? And you either do it full game or you do it at, for the first half. And so, like, to me, there's no way. And listen, I am the guy who was wanted nothing to do with the Hawks, right? You'll remember I said, okay, like between +7.5 with Atlanta and +10 with New Orleans in those 2 games, like that was a pretty big indicator, right? Like the second halves of those game 1s, like sometimes that stuff, it's not a narrative thing because it's not like everybody was talking about it, but it's one of those things that like, it's really sort of simplistic, but it works, right? Like Atlanta didn't have it for the second half of game 1. And then they didn't really have it in game 2. Now, again, that game was closer and like, obviously the Heat end up covering and that sort of thing. But like, that game was 5 or 6 points in the fourth quarter. So like, that's something, right? A little, some adjustments, obviously Trae Young playing much better. But again, what's the theme, right, of going from game 2 to game 3? The supporting cast. Supporting cast always going to be a little bit better for the home team. In this case, right, that's going to give a bump to the Hawks. It's going to drop the Heat a little bit here, right? And over the course of 48 minutes, maybe the Heat end up winning this game. But maybe we're just looking for a 24-minute type of a game, right? Maybe we're just looking for the first half from the Hawks. Now, again, want to reference the shot quality here. Game 2 actual score, 115 to 105. Shot quality score 114 to 103. Like that was a dead fair, it couldn't, it literally could be, I guess, more accurate, but it's hard. You'd be hard pressed to find a more accurate shot quality to game result type of a thing here. So it's not like there's some like fluke situation here where like, oh man, like the Heat are just making shots and all of that sort of thing. But on the flip side, they're also, it's not a situation where they're winning these games by 10 points when they should win them by 20. All right. So I look at this and I go, okay, if everything's pretty fair in this series, now we're going to flip the, home court element here. And how much is that going to matter? Because we flipped the home court, 5.5 points. That's about right. Right. So we're not going crazy necessarily here, but when it comes to the shot quality element, I think the Hawks are going to have much better of it. And now that Trae Young has had a good game, like we are going to, obviously there's a comfort level there. Maybe the outside shot is falling a little bit better for Trae. So again, whether you want to do that full game or whether you want to do a game 3, I think this is the only play that there is to make. It's Hawks or nothing for me in either one of those sort of facets here. And then obviously if they lose, like I'm basically going to ignore that there is such a thing as game 4, going to pass on that hard. And if they win, all of a sudden things become more interesting, right? Because then you are just one more home game away from tying this up. Just sort of by nature, worth mentioning that the series price 11-1 for the Hawks to come back and win the series. I certainly don't think that is enough. I would probably need roughly double that to even take a flyer on that, which of course is not, you're never going to get that price. And I just want to go back real quick on the Milwaukee-Chicago series price updated, if I can dig that up. And what do we got there? -260 for the Bucks, +215 for the Bulls in that series. Again, maybe that's a way that you want to play something, right? Where you are getting +215 on a series where Chris Middleton's injured and Chicago hasn't even played a home game yet. And the series is tied and they have been competitive in both games, right? Like those things are more, and again, there's a reason why one's +215 and one's 11-1, but +215 is not bad for a team going home tied 1-1 when the other team, one of their best players, top 3 players, is, maybe out for the series, certainly out for probably these next couple of games, I would assume.
Yeah, totally agree. It's very interesting numbers there for sure. Let's head to the West as the Grizzlies and the T-Wolves, series tied at 1, and Memphis with a massive bounce back win. They're favored now by 1.5 points heading into game 3. I don't know how much was adjustments. I don't know how much they just kind of woke up, but whatever it was, the attention was gotten, we'll say. Yeah. Super short number here for Memphis on the road. And I wonder what the number would have been without, just looking at the scores, right? Like what is the public perception of these 2 teams heading into a game 3 where, it was a pretty tale of 2 games, for lack of a better term. Sure. I'm going to be on Memphis -1.5 in this, just because we talked about it before, if the T-Wolves are going to make this spicy, but I still think Memphis is the better team and they're going to win and they have more depth and all of that other fun stuff. I still think the T-Wolves will make it spicy, but Memphis is going to come out on top and basically a pick'em game here.
Yeah. And I don't hate that by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, by now, or, if you've been following along here, literally given out 2 bets for this series. The first one was over 5.5 total games for this series, right? That we're 1-1 here. So we literally just need, each team to win 1 game. That's fun. And then the other thing was grabbing Memphis after losing that first game, right? And part of that was in the show, again, going back to shot quality, right? The actual score of that first game, Timberwolves 130, Grizzlies 117. The shot quality score for that game was 127-112 for the Grizzlies, right? And so if you were looking for something going into game 2, and listen, I talked about how I liked them at -7, the line went to -6.5. This was, maybe my best call and probably will be my best call of the entire playoffs at this point. And just the idea that, okay, for one, the Grizzlies had a better shot quality situation, right? And again, you can count up the points all you want, but to me, I want to know how you got the points, right? Were you pulling off some crazy shots, et cetera, et cetera? And that's what shot quality is, right? And it's no different from hockey or football, right? That's the basic metrics around scoring. How good of a shot do you get? And so the next game, you go, okay, you can take a bunch of different ways to get there. Is it Memphis is going to be more locked in? Are the Timberwolves going to be not as locked in because they got what they needed to get done? And you can get there narrative wise and you get a Memphis, blowout victory. Or you do it metrically and you go, man, the shot quality says they should have won the first game by 15. Let's run that back and assume that the shot quality is the same the very next game. And it pretty much was, right? And of course, they make a couple more than they should have instead of missing a lot more than they should have in the case of the Grizzlies. And so then the other bet is Memphis series price there was -125 is available. We certainly said -140, good enough for me. So I'm sitting here with total games over 5.5, and I'm sitting here with Memphis to win the series. So do I need to make another bet is fundamentally the question, right? And again, why make this more difficult than it has to be? right? You can sit back, and this is, by the way, the most entertaining series, right? And you and I pegged this. And of course, it ends up game 2 ends up on NBA TV, and you're sitting there going like, oh man, like this couldn't get at least a TNT treatment or an ESPN treatment. Like you're really kicking this the best series of the first round. I mean, I guess Brooklyn and Boston is sort of like truly the best series, but like what, second best series of the first round? You're kicking that to NBA TV. So I can sit back and I can go, okay, this game's going to be a pick'em. So is game 4. Why would I make another bet to sort of cut into what I think are really good bets? Obviously, Memphis series price right now is like in the minus 250 type of a range. So I'm sitting here with minus 140. So that's a really good bet. Obviously, with the first game split, 2-game split, like it can't be any better for an over 5.5 series total games, right? Can't do any better than that. So like, why would I start pressing my luck here, so to speak, right? Like I can sit back and watch these games and go, it'd be really great if both teams just split. And we would, everybody would be having a good time enjoying this from an entertainment standpoint, and the bets would be looking really, really good. Obviously, a split here goes 2-2, and we're guaranteed to win the over 5.5. And then at that point, I will be cheering for the Grizzlies to win that best of 3 final 3 games in which they have home court advantage still. Sitting pretty there. But can I tell you what's going to happen in game 3? Do I want to be grabbing, first half Timberwolves, full game Timberwolves, all of that stuff? All of that stuff, if you've been following along here, is just extra, right? Like that's just sort of like, dancing with the devil here. So why would I make a bet on a game that I think is really truly a coin flip? Now you can just say system-wise, I should be betting the T-Wolves. I should be betting the T-Wolves first half. Honestly, I have no problem with that, right? And like that makes a ton of sense. But if you're going to bet Memphis, the full game is where you're going to want to go with that, because I don't think the situation is Memphis just comes out in the first half and dominates earlier. Like that would be really surprising to me. And because that would be surprising, and because anything else would be sort of surprising, I'm just not going to bet this game. I've got enough going on with 2 bets in this series that's enough for me, right? And again, when there's 8 series, some of them you want to bet game by game. Some of them you want to bet series and not do anything else. Some you want to sort of massage halfway through. This is one where I've just got a couple of bets. They're both in really good shape. And that's fine. I'll just sit back and watch and enjoy, frankly, a really entertaining series.
No, totally get it. Totally agree. And another very interesting series in a way that I'm not sure many people thought it might be is the Mavs and the Jazz. This series tied at 1. Still no Luka Doncic. The Mavs win game 2. And this is a reason why I like to think the NBA playoffs is absolutely incredible. Game 2, you have Jalen Brunson going for 41 points, and Maxi Kleber, who was an 18% 3-point shooter post the All-Star break, goes 8 for 10 from 3. Mavs win without Luka, setting up a game 3. Still probably no Luka, though he's close, it seems. Series shifts to Utah, and the Jazz are favored by 7 points. Now, I know Utah has a massive home court advantage. I get all that. 7 points just seems really, 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 really high. 7 points just seems like a lot for just the way that this series has been played. And if you look at what was going down, like this is going to be very like basically what you're betting on in this game, whichever side you're on, is can the Mavs hit threes again? That's basically what you're betting on, because if you pay attention to how Utah loses in the playoffs every year, it's because Rudy Gobert gets chased off the floor because can he contest at the rim and then get out to the 3-point line? And that's what happened to Utah last year in the playoffs. They couldn't figure that out. They took an L to a Clippers team that didn't even have Kawhi Leonard in it, right? So you have these situations where we're here again. There's no Luka Doncic, and yet you're just facing a team that has figured out, okay, cool, we're going to drive. Gobert has to try to contest at the rim, and can he get out to 3-point land? And all the Mavs are doing, we're hitting open threes. So it's kind of weird because like that's a weird thing to sit and bet on. But that's basically what this is going to come down to. And I'm just betting on the fact of shooting wide open threes to try to cover a 7-point spread. That's where I'm going to be. I'm going to take the Mavs here, which is not what I said I was going to do at the start of the series. Start of the series, I said I was going to be on the Jazz and riding the Jazz every game that Luka doesn't play.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, buckle up here because we've got a lot going on, a lot of moving parts here. First and foremost, little pat on the old back here, right? Like, and yeah, you mentioned, you were on the Jazz, whatever. And I said before the series, like, are we positive based on all the stuff that you just said that the Mavs can't win a home game without Luka against this Jazz team, right? Yeah. Like, that was my thing. And I was just like, that's the question for this series, because if they can get one home game and extend this thing out until, you get another week, right? Because you're getting, game 4 on Saturday. If you can extend it out and maybe Luka can come back, like, that's the whole series, is can they get that one of those 2 games? Then the other thing was, and again, it's funny how things shift, but we talked about Monday, how my biggest sort of wrong was that I thought the point spread, again, Dallas at home against Utah, how that point spread was just fundamentally made up, right? Like, that line was 4.5, goes to 5.5. We're all just kind of guessing, right? We're like, oh, no Luka, like, okay, whatever, right? And I'm like, the Jazz are either going to win this game by a ton, or the Mavericks are going to win this game outright. And the weird thing was, the Jazz won by basically the exact point spread that was given out, right? 5.5 point spread, they win by 6. And we look back and we think immediately, we go, okay, I guess I was wrong about that. And that the point spread was correct, right? And that, like, we just go, but we're doing that thing in almost reverse from when, like, there's a pick'em game and one team wins by 20. Right. And we go like, oh man, they should have never been a pick'em. Like, what are we like? Oh, that was dumb, blah, blah, blah. But then game 2, it's back to being a pick'em again, where the outlier was the 20-point game, right? This case, the outlier might have been that it was really accurate, the point spread. Right. And you go, okay, like, that was the fluke. The fluke was that the Jazz won that game by exactly 6 instead of the Mavericks winning, or instead of the Jazz winning by a ton. So all that is to say, okay, you can either believe that the first point spread was correct, right, at -5.5, or you believe that it wasn't. And that's your question for this game. Okay, so I realize there's a lot to unpack there. And why that's the case is, if you believe that that point spread was correct at 5.5 on the road, right, which, again, if you believe that, the 2 ways that you can sort of test yourself on whether you believe that 5.5 point spread was correct. 1, did you ever bet the Jazz -5.5? Right. And 2, did you ever not bet the game because you thought the point spread was correct? Because if either of those things were the case in that game, then you believe that at the very least, the Jazz should have been 5.5 point road favorites against the Mavericks without Luka Doncic. Okay, so you've got that belief system sitting right there. As we go to game 3 here, not rocket science, this line opened 6. Now it's up to 7. It's a 1.5 point difference than it was in those first 2 games, which means you're trying to tell me that the shift from Dallas to the home court advantage of Utah, and say what you want about the team on the court, that home court advantage is worth at least 4 points. And so if you give 3 to the Mavericks, right, that's 7 altogether. This line should be 12.5, right? Like, based on if you believe that game, that 5.5 point spread was correct. Now, again, you might change your mind because of what you saw in game 2, but what you saw in game 2 was, as you mentioned, Jalen Brunson, 41 points, Maxi Kleber hitting shots left and right. And speaking of bets that I didn't make, I went back and took a look at Spencer Dinwiddie on his point total, saw it went up from 20.5 to 21.5. And I was like, no, you know what, man, I'm just going to lay out on my Spencer Dinwiddie business. And then I scrolled down and I saw your man's Maxi Kleber, and his total points was 5.5. And I did not pull the trigger on over 5.5 for Kleber, even though I watched him getting shots up in game 1. I thought to myself, like, yeah, that's really low for Klebs. Now Klebs goes and he hits his shots. But the point is that, it's not a point spread, it's a total. Maxi Kleber's shots or points were 5.5. Jalen Brunson's certainly were not 41, right? So both of those guys, again, generally supporting characters, going from home to the road, both of those guys' point totals have to be coming way, way down, right? And so if they are going to come way, way down, then that's where the difference is going to be made up here. And so I just look at this, like, I get why, anything sort of above 6, sort of, especially with a team that just won, this is very much, very similar to the Minnesota-Memphis situation where you just watch the underdog win and now you go, oh, they're getting all these points. But whether it's a shift in sort of, identity or sort of a metric evaluation, the way that we had with that other series, or whether it's just a flat out shift in location, again, they open this thing 6 because the idea of like Luka might be back, because that is a Luka type of a line, right? Like if these two teams are more evenly matched in the 4-5 seeding the way that they are, if Luka plays, then this should be like Boston and Brooklyn, right? Where it's -3.5 for whoever's on the home team. But we just watched an 8-point, 9-point shift because Luka wasn't playing for the games in Dallas. So there's got to be a 9-point shift because Luka's not going to play in Utah. And so if you look at it from okay, they would be -3.5. What if there's a 9-point shift? 12.5, right? So like it keeps gravitating back to the idea here that the Jazz could be double-digit favorites here at home. If this was a regular season game, right? It feels like you'd be sitting there on a Thursday and you'd be like, oh man, like Mavericks are going to Utah. Like Luka's not playing tonight. What's the line going to be? It's going to be like 12.5. And so you're sitting there and you're going, okay, I think the sportsbooks actually kind of made a mistake when they opened -6. Now I bet that right away. And like, I am fine recommending -7 in the same way that I bet -6, but I'm just sitting here going like, yeah, I don't love this Jazz team either. And I think this series ends up being competitive because hopefully Luka comes back in game 4. But I think this is one where like the Mavs also get that exhale the same way Minnesota did, where you go, man, like we got that one game. Now it's weird because they just needed the one game at home, whereas most of these teams just look for that one game on the road. But they're sitting there going, okay, Luka's not coming back, but we get him for game 4. That's their hope right now. And so I just think it's a really, really tough spot to see Brunson do what he did now on the road, Kleber do what he did on the road. And if those two guys don't, it's not like there are 2 other guys in like a Siakam Van Fleet type situation where you go, well, okay, even if Gary Trent Jr. doesn't score a ton of points, and OG Anunoby isn't as good as he was, at least their star players are going to play really well. That just doesn't exist with Dallas. So honestly, I think Dallas gets absolutely blown out in this game, again, on the assumption that Luka doesn't play. And that this line, if there were any other circumstance other than the sort of idea that maybe he does, like we're not hearing like he's running around. We're not hearing he's playing 4-on-4, which is my favorite thing about the Ben Simmons thing. It's like, well, he's playing 4-on-4. It's like, well, let's not get crazy until they add one more player on either side of the teams. It's like, what? How does that make any difference? It's not like we're getting that. And by the way, if he does play, what kind of Luka are we going to get, right? Are we going to get hobbling around Luka that like, while we remember some of the really great performances of him sort of hobbling around, there's also some not so great performances of him hobbling around, right? And where is this line going to go? Is it going to go all the way back down to, again, where we think it should be if Luka plays and everybody's healthy, which is still Jazz -3.5? Is it going to go all the way down to 3.5 if Luka comes back? I don't think so, because I don't think you're obviously not going to get full strength Luka. So how far down is it going to go? Is it going to go to 5? Is it going to go to 6? Like, I don't think you're making, even if you make a bet on -7 right now, or if you grab the -6, I don't think you're losing that much if it's like, oh, Luka's coming back. Like here, he's Willis Reed type situation here. Like, I don't think you're losing anything but that much, I should say, by making this bet now. And again, I just think this point spread, should be higher. Nobody loves the Jazz. That's part of the element here. We're all dying, right, for Dallas to win this series and get the Jazz out of our lives and ideally like have them broken up, blah, 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 blah. But like, you can't bet with what you hope is going to happen. The best thing we can do is we can analyze these markets. And again, whether you think that 5.5 was right, I think that depends on your point of view and what you did before. But I wouldn't get too caught up in that one game where we saw some really big outlier performances for the Mavs and then just assume that 5.5 was wrong. And that's coming from the guy who, before the series started, was wondering if that 5.5 was wrong or not. So like, it's not like I am, sort of attached to the idea of that being the correct point spread, but the market seemed to think so because this is the NBA and we had basically a full week, whether it was going into game 1 or going into game 2, to all weigh in and correct that wrong point spread. Nobody did that, right? Nobody put in enough money to change that line, right? And if anything, they did from -4.5 to -5.5 before game one. So again, I don't think I'm wrong in all this. Now, does it mean that the Mavs have no chance of winning? You're absolutely right, man. Three-pointers, it's the biggest variance element in the game, right? And like, that's just the situation in not just the NBA, but 2022 basketball. They could hit a bunch of threes. I just don't see that happening here. I think the Jazz win. I think they do so really comfortably.
Speaking of winning very comfortably, you got the Warriors up 2-0 over the Denver Nuggets, and the series is pretty much playing out how many thought they would, especially with Steph Curry being back and the Warriors offense really firing on all cylinders. People talking about their small ball lineup with Poole and Clay and Steph and Wiggins and Draymond. And I mean, it's not looking good for the Nuggets. Even as they go home, the Warriors are favored by 2 points in this series. And I'm going to still be rolling with the Warriors. It's guard play, and there's not enough guards that can play for the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah.
Just that simple. I'm still going to be on the Warriors -2.
Yeah, again, for me, same sort of story here, right? Why make betting harder than it has to be, right? So we come in at the start of the series, we go, man, I really like -1.5. I really like -2.5 on the series handicap, right? Where we're getting +240 for the Warriors to win this in 5 games or less, and then basically even money for them to win this in 6 games or less. And so we got what we needed done. We hit the first game -5, 5.5 from like the very first part of the week, and we go, okay, like this is great. Why make this harder than it needs to be? Why press our luck with the Warriors, or why fade the Warriors at this point? I'm not going to do either of those things, right? Again, if you want to go systematically here, and this is another pick'em type game, and you want to grab home team first half, more power to you. Absolutely recommend that as far as like not being a bad idea. But I'm sitting here with a handful of units there potentially. If the Warriors take care of business, they can drop this game and I will still be okay. So the way I look at it is, I watch this game, the Warriors win, I'm up 3-0. And now I know for sure, no matter what happens in game 4, I'm going to, just need the Warriors to win a home game in game 5, which they had absolutely no trouble in doing in those first 2 games. Or if the Nuggets win, now we've got a 2-1 series. We're going to have still a pick'em type of a spread. And at that point, I can look at my bet and I can go, do I want to have a little bit more on the Warriors or do I not? Right? Because again, if my assumption is that the Warriors win outright in game 5, my bet, the 4-1 series one, right, the -2.5 handicap, is going to come down to game 4, right? And so I'm just going to look at that and I'll be like, okay, do I want a little bit more on this bet, or do I want to just stay where it is? Right. And so whatever happens in this game 3 is going to decide what I do in game 4, but I'm certainly not betting on game 3 because again, I have done my work, right? It's not that much different than some of these other series where I have done my work before the series started to put myself in a good place for a series and for a game like game 3, where I don't need to try to guess whether it's going to translate at home for the Nuggets or whether it's not going to translate at home. And part of the premise of that bet, by the way, was the urgency of the Warriors, right? The idea was, listen, for every extra game they have to play, it makes them more unlikely to win later on, right? So if they have to go to 7 games, even if they win this series, if they have to go to 6 games, even if they win this series, it makes them, because of the mileage on their top veteran players, it makes them less likely to beat the Suns down the line, right? Or even in the next round, depending on who that ends up being, right? It just hurts their overall win probability. So they have urgency, an urgency like the Sixers might not have, for example, or some of these other teams that are going into game 3s. And so again, like that would be reason not to bet the Nuggets. The reason not to bet the Warriors is I'm already invested in the Warriors, right? So why go crazy? So it doesn't have to be that difficult. Sometimes you just let things ride. And that's what I'm doing for game 3 here.
Oh, totally get it. Pelicans and the Suns series is tied at 1, and it's been a very, very weird series. It just got even stranger as the first half of game 2 was basically highlighted by Devin Booker hitting a shot and then dapping up a baby in the front row. And then shortly after, there's a hamstring injury. And now we don't know the status going forward with Devin Booker. We know he's out at least game 3 and 4 at least. This means the Suns are favored by 1 on the road in New Orleans. And this is one where, you know, Chris Paul is going to have to be the Chris Paul point god that he is here. And I'm kind of trusting in that. And if he can stay healthy, because obviously the biggest worry if you're the Suns is the Chris Paul injury coming at the same time that the Devin Booker injury is also taking place. But yeah, heading into game 3, I don't know, Suns -1. I'm still going to be on the Suns here in this game, just as it's going to be tough. It's going to be a crazy, crazy game. We already know the series is shifting onto, you know, different home team. Obviously, New Orleans going to be fired up, playing a lot better. Yeah, it's a tough one, but because I'm forcing myself to make a pick here in this game, I'm going to take the Suns -1.
Yeah, I mean, so there's -1, there's -1.5 there, and I'm with you on this. This one's a little bit different, right? Like this one, obviously, there's an element to the injury here, right? This isn't, and obviously the Pelicans won that last game too, right? This isn't the returning home down 0-2 desperation mode, right? This is the Suns being like, hey, like we're in a series all of a sudden, and we're without Devin Booker. Now, Devin Booker probably should have gone with the same strategy I go with in my general life, and that is to avoid babies at all costs, because clearly that's a devil baby who, you know, clearly messed with Devin Booker's hamstring, right? You can't convince me of anything other than that. I look at this game and I go, okay, well, let's first and foremost, we got to do the market thing where we go, okay, they were 10 at home, which if we go, okay, 3 points for the Suns at home and 3 points for the Pels on, you know, at home. So full switch, that's 6 points. This line should be 4. And you go, okay, it's not 4. Why is it not 4? Well, the easy answer to that is Devin Booker's not playing. And my guy had 31 points in the first half, and he's probably going to matter in this game. So how far do you drop that down? 2.5? Does that sound about right to you? The answer, of course, is maybe, right? And this opened pick'em. So it was actually 4 points. And then the market sort of said, that's a little bit too much. Why? And this is the crux of the bet. Because the Suns are really good, right? The Suns are really good, whether it's with Booker or without Booker, whether it was with Chris Paul or without Chris Paul. Now, I think Chris Paul is obviously the key here in that, you know, point God, you make everybody else better when he goes out of the lineup, right? Whether it's, you know, defense. Well, I was going to say, yeah, Cameron Payne, like the drop off, so to speak, defensively on their sort of, you know, exterior defense, if you will, right? Where it's like defensively, that's an issue. And then offensively, that's an issue as well, right? Like he matters more to what everybody else is doing than even Devin Booker does, even though the stats will go, okay, right? We talk about it with Luka, where it's like, okay, if Devin Booker was going to get 30, how do you make up those 30 points? Well, when you have Chris Paul, right, you're probably getting an extra 6 out of him because he's going to be more likely to shoot, but you're also going to make up those points by Chris Paul creating for everyone else, right? So when Chris Paul is out, you go, okay, well, who's going to create for everyone else? Everybody's kind of on their own. And it turns into like the Suns pre-Chris Paul, which was to say like not a particularly good basketball team. Now I know obviously they have better players with Mikal Bridges and DeAndre Ayton, et cetera, et cetera. So it's obviously not the same thing, but like, I just mentioned 2 really good players that are still in the lineup, right? Like the DeAndre Ayton, Chris Paul version of the Suns is still a really good team with obviously their supporting players as well. And so listen, as much as like the Pelicans have had this really good run, and I give them all the credit in the world for winning that game in Phoenix, something that nobody thought was going to happen. It was our first, but our other +10 underdog money line outright winner this postseason, which is like, you know, it's the NBA. You don't see it that often. We've already got one. We haven't even had 5 days of actual playoff play. As much as like, that's great. Like the Suns are still capable of winning without one of their best players. Now, if they add a second injury in the mix here, now we're talking something problematic here for the Suns, but that's not the case here. So this is one where, you know, again, you want to go system, then you're hitting the Pelicans first half, all of that sort of thing. I just don't think that fits the system in the same way. And so I like the Suns here in this game. I like them to get back, the 2-1 series lead. I'm very tempted at a -270 series price. Like I know that's laying a lot, so to speak, as far as that, you know, like the juice is concerned. But even without Devin Booker, and maybe, you know, if he's out for the series, you know, I still sort of feel the same way. minus 270. Like, that's a really good price if you can find that out there. Once it hits sort of a minus 300, that's definitely not something I would be looking to do. But it's just, I find it hard to believe that the Pelicans are just going to shock the Suns in a 7-game series where I think the Suns are more than capable of winning on the road. This isn't a home team or bust type of a team in the Suns, even without Devin Booker. So yeah, I'm right there with you with the Suns here. Minus one if you can find it, minus 1.5 if you can't.
Amazing. And much like the NBA playoffs, night in, night out, always entertaining for sure. I know there's a lot going on, so let the people know where they can find you, some of the things that are on your mind and what's going on in the world of Mr. Matt Russell.
Yeah, I think I know what you're referring to, because listen, a lot of times, you know me, like we talk about a lot of this stuff and, the betting industry type stuff and all of that kind of thing. And, obviously Twitter, by the way, at MRussAuthentic, MRUSS Authentic. It's a place where, we all get to pile in on some stuff and people say some things and you go like, wait, what's going on here? And man, it takes everything for me not to just go off in a lot of cases. And I have avoided sort of piling in on the Woj comments from earlier on in the week, but I want to talk about that here because, normally I try to bring things like this up because I don't want to bring shine on this person or that person in the sports betting industry. Now, the problem is, the big people in the sports industry are now the big people in the sports betting industry because now all of that stuff has congealed, right? It's no longer a niche thing. It's no longer our little own pocket, right? And so I look at this and I go, and I don't want to do the stick to sports or stay in your lane type of thing because I don't think that's right, all right? The stick to sports thing is a very lazy thing. People are people and they can have opinions. But the problem is when you don't stay in your lane and you don't stick to what you know best, you open yourself up to do what the Adam Schefters of the world and the Wojs of the world have shown is that you can be really good at something, right? You can cultivate all these sources and you can be dropping bombs and you can be doing all of that stuff. And ESPN hired this guy and they gave him, 6 months of training to try to figure out how to speak on television. And they got him to a point where he could speak on television. Unfortunately, it's gone too far. And we're now letting him talk about things he has no clue about what he's talking about. And he is now sounding like an utter moron in the sports betting space, which is ironic for a couple of different reasons. For one, the irony is, and everybody's pointed this out throughout the week, how wrong he is. And it's less about the fact that he is wrong, which of course he is, because everybody's mentioned you cannot make a bet in Massachusetts. He has not mentioned anything about the fact that the Boston crowd has long been an issue, right? Right down to like fighting the referee on the court, right? We haven't in 2022 gotten advanced to the point where the Boston fans or fans in general are above that. Security has just gotten better. That's the difference, right? He barely mentions alcohol, right? When we know everything negative is fueled by intoxication when it comes to inside an arena, et cetera, right? All these people walk in, they walk in sober, right? They wouldn't be making the decisions that they make after a couple of casual beverages, right? By the way, as if this was the first time any player had returned in some sort of vitriolic, not vitriotic. You might use the word vitriotic if you are idiotic, but it's not the first time a vitriolic situation has happened with a player returning. So like, are we blaming the Cavs' reaction to LeBron returning because somebody might have had a parlay, a single gamer, right? Like this is so ridiculous. So now we don't even have to talk about all of that stuff. But the real issue is who is talking about it, because that's the important part, whether you're getting your handicapping advice from anyone, Woj, anybody else on mainstream or otherwise. The answer to the question is always, who is talking about this? This is a guy who no one on earth, Sheldon, has made more money thanks to betting on basketball than Adrian Wojnarowski. Now you're sitting there going like, what do you mean? Like he bets on basketball? Like he doesn't get paid, blah, blah, blah. This is a guy who went when his contract was up and took offers from the sportsbook companies. This is a group of companies who are throwing money at talent, and you see some people grabbing it and jumping ship. And he used the competition, right? Because there isn't that much. The funny thing is about the Schefters and the Wojs, prior to sports betting, there wasn't that much competition for their services, right? Like Woj, he levels up and goes to ESPN, but this isn't really something that TNT does. Right. And you have Shams doing his thing as well. And that's, internal competition, as in the two of them sort of going at it to break news. But there isn't another company dying to get Woj until sportsbooks came around. And now all of a sudden his inside information is really valuable to sportsbooks. So what does he do as part of negotiations? He goes, hey, all these sportsbooks want me, they're going to pay me this amount of money, blah, 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 blah. Give me tens of millions of dollars a year to tweet out news that, by the way, separate story, but in 2022, we don't really need the Wojs of the world to break news. Players are breaking news all the time. One of these days we'll talk about your man's Debo demanding a trade. We didn't need Jeff Darlington to break that news. Debo is just walking around saying that to people, right? And so this guy is literally biting the hand that feeds him in these comments that are just completely, absolutely unnecessary, not to mention completely false. And so it's embarrassing that we have to even deal with this. Now, again, is it part of the plan? Does this guy need the shine, to say something just to go viral? You and I have talked about other people who do that. Doesn't seem like he should. The guy has got it made in the shade here. Just sit down, shut up, and tell us who's going to sign where and what's going on in the drama-filled NBA. Don't try to tell us that people are yelling at Kyrie Irving because he's not going over his point total and blah, 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 right? Because that's just BS, and we're better than that as a society, or at least I hope we can be, because, by the way, right, society has not gotten better in 2022 as far as their behavior outside in public. And it certainly has nothing to do with betting. It has a lot to do with just where we are. And social media has a lot to do with it. And you know who's really benefited by social media as well? Adrian Wojnarowski.
Yeah, no, it was a super interesting story that I didn't really get. Who cares if someone is yelling at Kyrie Irving or whatever other player because of their over? Who cares? What's the difference? How...
The drunk guy is going to yell at Kyrie Irving for one reason or another, and it's not going to be because of that, right? It's just insane.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's too much going on right now, just in media and in whatever corner of the media people are in, where people don't realize that, not everything is for you. You know what I mean? And there's so many different things that get lumped into one, but there's people who are betting, actually betting. There are people who are creating content, and there are people who tweet, right? And those things get all lumped into being the same thing, but they're not, right? You're hitting different audiences, you're doing different things, you're achieving different outcomes, but we talk about it and mention it as if it's the same, and it really isn't. Right. And that's okay. I don't know. I just found it to be a weird thing. We're just all right, Woj, cool, man. Cool story, bro. But yeah, thanks for jumping on with us once again here on the DRF Sports Podcast. Really appreciate it, my dude. And we'll do this again down the line. I guess when? I don't even know what day of the week it is. Monday. We'll do it again on Monday. Get caught up on the NBA action. Thanks again, man.
Sounds good, brother.
And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder. If you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, we got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.